And we're going to talk first about the differences between a chemical and electrical synapse. Okay, so a synapse is essentially the functional area of connection between a neuron and a cell that's being signaled. So we have one neuron and another type of cell that is signaling. This can be another neuron, this can be a smooth muscle cell, this can be a cardiac muscle cell, a skeletal muscle cell, or an epithelial cell of granular tissue. Okay. So normally, when we have two neurons at a synapse, this is in the central nervous system. And typically, when we have a neuron signaling another type of cell, an effector tissue, this is in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, we're going to talk a lot about that when we get to the autonomic nervous system and the signaling of those different types of neurons. So if one neuron is signaling another neuron, we have two neurons in series. The first neuron is going to be a presynaptic neuron, because this is the neuron before the synapse. And the second neuron will be a postsynaptic neuron. Now, a presynaptic neuron can signal three areas. So this gives us three different types or varieties of synapses. We can have an axodendritic synapse, an axosomatic synapse, or an axoaxonic synapse. All right, now most synapses that we're going to encounter are axodendritic, and they're also unidirectional. All right, so let's review the structure of a synapse. Let's review the anatomy of a neuron. Okay, so to define a synapse, we said that this is the functional connection and this is going to be between a neuron and another cell that it is going to signal. Okay. Now we have three different types of neurons. We're going to talk about those in a little minute. But the two main types of synapses, the two main types of synapses are electrical and chemical synapses. All right, those we'll distinguish in a minute as well. Now, just to review our anatomy here of a neuron, this is our soma or cell body. These fingery spider-like projections are our dendrites. Okay, this is our axon. And this is our terminal bouton or the axon terminal. Okay, the axon terminal, also called the terminal bouton. Okay, this is our first neuron, so we'll call this the presynaptic. Now, the terminal bouton of this neuron will synapse with the soma or cell body of an adjacent neuron. So we have another cell body here, another neuron. And then the second neuron will typically synapse with some other type of tissue. Okay, we'll talk about what those are in a minute. Okay. Now, as you mentioned before, we have a traditional synapse where two neurons speak to each other. So this is neuron 1. This is your postsynaptic neuron. And two neurons will usually communicate at a synapse. So this is the synapse here. And this is typically in the central nervous system. Okay. Now, when we leave the central nervous system, and when I say central nervous system, I'm referring to brain and spinal cord. When I say peripheral nervous system, it's everything outside of that. Okay, so your peripheral nerves and so on and so forth. The second neuron will leave the central nervous system and it will travel out into the peripheral nervous system and it will synapse with some other type of tissue. Okay? So the options that we have for a neuron to synapse is one, to synapse with another neuron. And this, again, is typically in the central nervous system. There are exceptions at ganglia, which we will talk about later on. Right? That's not quite important now. Right? But this is usually in the central nervous system. The second option for a neuron to synapse is at some sort of effector tissue. So this can be muscle, skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle. This can be glands, or this can be adipose tissue. Okay. So this would be your typical synapse here. This is what we're going to speak about for the rest of the day. This synapse here that happens in the CNS. And then later on, when we talk about the neuromuscular junction, when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, we'll talk about this other synapse here, which happens in the peripheral nervous system. So the name here would be either the neuromuscular junction or the neuroeffector junction. Okay. So I'll say that again. So we have a synapse, which is a functional connection between a neuron and some other cell that it's signaling. There are two options for that other cell. It can either be another neuron, which is in the central nervous system, and this is where the terminal bouton of one neuron, the presynaptic neuron, communicates with the cell body of the postsynaptic neuron, a second neuron. Now, this second neuron will leave the central nervous system, and this is our second option for another type of synapse. If this second neuron synapses onto a muscle cell, an epithelial cell of glandular tissue, or an adipose cell, okay? And in this case, this synapse will have a different name. It would be called either the neuromuscular junction or the neuroeffector junction, depending on which of these types of tissues we're synapsing on, or which of these cells we're synapsing on. Okay? Let's talk briefly about the three types of connections between neurons. Oh, sure. Okay, so we said that there are three types of neurons. Let's just describe what those are: the axodendritic, the axosomatic, and the axoaxonic. Okay, is everyone good with this one? Yep. All right. So let's talk about those three types of neurons. All right, so we'll say types of neurons. So the first thing is we have our presynaptic neuron. Our terminal bouton here. Okay. This is not types, this is types of synapses. All right, so this is types of synapses, not types of neurons. Okay, now the terminal bouton, these are all presynaptic neurons. And these will all be postsynaptic neurons. So the terminal bouton of a presynaptic neuron can synapse with one of three different places on a second neuron. It can synapse onto the dendrites of that neuron. So this is your postsynaptic neuron, and these are the dendrites, okay? And the dendrites are specifically where this terminal bouton will synapse. Okay, and this is called your axodendritic synapse. These are your dendrites. The second place we can synapse is onto the soma or the cell body of an adjacent neuron. Okay. So directly onto the soma, and this is called your axosomatic synapse. Right? And then the third variation here is that you can have two terminal boutons synapsing onto each other. So two terminal boutons communicating here, and this is called an axoaxonic synapse. Okay? So we're going to speak more about these when we talk specifically about the chemical synapse, but I want you to understand where exactly this terminal bouton is synapsing at when we reference this chemical synapse. Now, the most common variation here, the one that we see the most often, is the axodendritic synapse. Okay, I'll sort of underline that. So this is the most common. Okay. So when we refer to a synapse going forward, we're really referring to the axodendritic type of synapse. And that's going to be important in understanding what's happening. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, let's move on. Are we done with this? No?
No, can you wait, please?
All right, so I'll give another minute. We can also have a fourth type, which is much less common, which is where two dendrites synapse. But again, that's much less common. You don't even need to be bothered about that one. Okay, so let's move on here. Everyone good with this? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so that was the basic understanding of a synapse and what's happening. Now, with that said, we have two types of synapses, an electrical synapse and a chemical synapse. We're going to speak very limitedly about the electrical synapse. We're not going to talk a lot about it. We're going to speak about it on one slide, and it's not very well understood. There's still a lot of research happening with electrical synapses. Previous research suggested that it was only found in the developing brain, and it was not at all seen in the adult brain. More recent research has proven that that's not true. We do have electrical synapses in the adult brain. And so there's not a whole lot understood about the electrical synapse. And it's not very common, so we will not speak about it a lot. The chemical synapse is where we will really focus for the remainder of today. Okay, so the electrical synapse, important features about it is that two neurons are connected by gap junctions. So gap junctions are a structure that we will continue to see. Okay, this is a channel or an area that allows for communication between two cells. So you can have gap junctions between two neurons or between neurons and other glial cells. We'll talk about glial cells later on. These are supporting cells in the nervous system. Now, the unique feature of electrical synapses is that they allow for rapid, open flow of communication between two cells, between two neurons. Okay, so this is one neuron. This is the cytoplasm of that cell. This is an adjacent neuron, and these are connected via this gap junction. Now, the gap junction is formed by these tiny proteins called connexons. So think of this little individual purple rod here as one connexon, And they form a passageway or a channel that runs between these two cells. So it's an area that allows free communication of ions and other second messengers from one cell to the other. Now, the flow of information here is usually bidirectional. Okay, it's usually bidirectional, and it's the direct flow of current from one cell to the other. This is why we call this an electrical synapse. We don't have any neurotransmitters here, we don't have any vesicles here, and we have a bidirectional flow of communication. So depending on the environment in one cell, depending on the needs of one cell versus the other, we can have the flow of current going in either direction across that gap junction. The signal can be either excitatory or inhibitory. And when I say that, I mean the signal that's coming across can either depolarize the adjacent cell or it can hyperpolarize the adjacent cell. Okay, that is not the case with chemical synapses. Some of the areas where we have identified electrical synapses are going to be the retina, the cortex, the brainstem, areas like the pons and the medulla, and then the hypothalamus. Okay? And that's pretty much all we're going to talk about for the electrical synapse. So the take-home message is there's rapid flow of communication, there's the presence of gap junctions, which allow that rapid communication, and there's a bidirectional flow of information or of signals from one cell to the other. Let's talk about the chemical synapse. So the chemical synapse is pretty much what we really drew, what we discussed as that initial interaction between two neurons. There's a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron. Now, this is usually an axodendritic synapse, as we mentioned earlier, where the axon terminal of one neuron synapses with the dendrites of a neighboring neuron. So I'll point that out here. Okay, so of the three types of neurons we drew, the axodendritic neuron, or the axodendritic synapse, is between, again, the terminal bouton of a presynaptic neuron and the dendrites of a postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so this is your axodendritic synapse, and this is the most common type of synapse that we see as chemical synapses.